heat in Texas didn't just press down. It held a grudge. It clung to the back of Elias Vance's neck like a physical weight, a constant reminder that this land was a crucible, designed to burn away anything soft. For 10 years since the war, he'd sought peace in this punishing silence. But peace was a skittish thing. Most days, the silence was broken only by the buzz of horseflies or the weary creak of the windmill. But on days like this, it was filled with ghosts. The ghosts of Gettysburg. Their phantom cries carried on the wind that swept across the sun-baked plains. He reined in his horse, a mare the color of dust, and listened. It wasn't the familiar rustle of a rattlesnake or the distant lowing of cattle. This was different. A sound so faint, it was almost nothing. A thread of noise nearly lost in the vast, empty canvas of the afternoon. It came again. A whimper. It was a sound that didn't belong. Not out here, miles from any homestead but his own. Animal, he told himself. A coyote with a broken leg. A calf tangled in barbed wire. He was a man who had trained himself to ignore the world's suffering, to mind his own patch of dirt, and nothing more. But his body, honed by 4 years of war, reacted before his mind could object. He slid from the saddle, his boots landing silently in the cracked earth. Rifle in hand, he moved with a predator's quiet, his eyes scanning the landscape of mesquite and stunted brush. He followed the sound toward a solitary, skeletal oak tree that clawed at the sky. Its branches were bare, twisted into tortured shapes by a century of relentless wind. As he drew closer, the whimpering stopped, replaced by a ragged, shallow breathing that was even more terrifying. His heart hammered against his ribs. He saw it then, and the air left his lungs in a sharp, cold rush. Huddled at the base of the tree was a person, a young black woman, crumpled against the gnarled roots like a doll cast aside. Her dress was torn, her skin marred with the angry purple of bruises and the dark, crusted red of dried blood. Above her, hanging from the thickest branch, was the real horror. A thick rope, its fibers frayed where a desperate knife had sawed it through, leaving a noose swinging gently in the breeze. An inch from her head, embedded in the tree's bark, was the glint of a discarded Bowie knife. Elias froze, his training taking over. He scanned the area in a slow, deliberate circle. He saw the tracks. At least 4 sets of boots, heavy and deep. The churned-up dirt of several horses, ridden hard and fast away from the scene. A lynch mob. They had been interrupted. Or perhaps they'd thought the job was done and left her for the buzzards. He took a step back, a cold dread washing over him. This was Monroe territory, and Jedediah Monroe, the man who owned this land and everything on it, did not tolerate complications. The man ruled his corner of Texas with an iron fist and a deep-seated hatred for anyone who wasn't white and subservient. To be found here, with her, was a death sentence. "Leave," a voice in his head screamed. "This is not your fight. You came here to be left alone. You earned that much." He almost listened. He turned, ready to melt back into the landscape, to erase the last 5 minutes from his memory. But as he looked at the woman one last time, her chest giving another weak, stuttering rise, another image superimposed itself over the scene. Cold Harbor, 1864. The smell of gunpowder and blood, so thick you could taste it. A boy from Ohio, no older than 17, lay trapped under a fallen cannon wheel, his face pale with shock. He was pleading, his voice a whisper. "Don't leave me, Corporal, please." But the Confederate line was advancing, a wave of gray and steel. Elias's captain had screamed the order to fall back, retreat or die. Elias had met the boy's eyes for a fraction of a second, a moment of shared, helpless terror, and then he had run. He had saved his own skin and left the boy to his fate. He never even learned his name. The memory was a hot spike in his gut. He had run from the war, but the war had followed him home. And tonight, it was lying at his feet, asking for a debt to be paid. "Damn it all to hell," he breathed, the words a curse and a prayer. The decision was made. The fragile peace he had built for himself, shattered like glass. He moved quickly now, his hesitation gone, replaced by a grim resolve. He knelt beside the woman, his calloused fingers gently searching for a pulse at her neck. It was there, thready and weak, but it was there. She was alive. Her eyelids fluttered. For a moment, two dark, unfocused eyes stared up at him, filled with a terror so profound it was almost animal. A low, guttural sound of fear escaped her lips before she lapsed back into unconsciousness. "I'm not them," he said softly, more to himself than to her. "I'm not one of them." He looked around one last time, the setting sun casting long, ominous shadows across the plains. There was no time. Whoever had done this could come back to admire their handiwork. With a grunt, he carefully scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, as if the ordeal had hollowed her out, leaving only skin and bone and a flicker of a soul. He carried her back to his horse, his movements sure and steady. He mounted, settling her in front of him, her head lolling against his chest. Her breathing was a warm, faint puff against his shirt, as he urged the mare into a steady walk back toward the distant silhouette of his ranch. He knew, with chilling certainty, that he had just invited the devil to his doorstep. He had just declared a private war on Jedediah Monroe and his kin, and he hadn't even fired a shot. Back in the one-room cabin that he called home, the world outside fell away into the deep blue of twilight. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire he'd built in the hearth and the quiet hiss of the lantern. He had laid her on his own cot, the only soft place in the entire house. Now, with a basin of warm water and a clean rag, he began the grim, delicate work of cleaning her wounds. He was methodical, his hands surprisingly gentle for a man whose life had been shaped by violence. He dabbed at the cuts on her face, washed the dirt from the raw, rope-burned skin on her wrists. Each new injury he uncovered was a testament to a cruelty he knew all too well. He had seen it on the battlefield. The way men could become monsters when they believed they had God and justice on their side. She stirred again, moaning softly in her fevered sleep, her brow furrowed in a nightmare he could only imagine. He paused, his hand hovering over a deep gash on her forehead. He looked at this stranger, this woman whose name he didn't know, whose story was a mystery. By bringing her here, he had tied his fate to hers. The silence he had craved was now a memory. The ghosts he had tried to outrun were no longer just in his head. They were riding across the Texas plains, and they were coming for him. He dipped the rag back into the water, the clear liquid turning a faint pink. He didn't know if he was strong enough to win this fight. He only knew he was no longer capable of running from it. He would stand his ground. For her, and for the boy from Ohio, whose name he never learned. For 2 days, the silence in the cabin was a living thing, thick with fear and suspicion. Elias moved with a quiet economy, a man accustomed to solitude, but now his every action was being watched. He'd leave a bowl of broth or a tin cup of water on the small crate beside the cot, then retreat to the porch, giving her the room he imagined she needed. He slept out there, his bedroll laid on the hard planks, the rifle never more than an arm's length away. It was a self-imposed exile in his own home. On the third morning, he walked in to find the broth gone and the cup empty. It was the first sign. He glanced at the cot. She was awake, propped up against the wall, the thin blanket pulled up to her chin like a shield. Her eyes, no longer unfocused, followed his every move. They were dark and intelligent, and filled with a guarded intensity that made the hair on his arms stand up. There was no terror in them now, only a cold, hard appraisal. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, and set a piece of hardtack and a strip of jerky on the crate. "There's more if you want it," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. She didn't respond, didn't even blink. He hadn't expected her to. He turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. The porch floorboards creaked under his weight as he sat down to sharpen his knife. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a familiar, grounding sound. He was letting the silence do the work, giving her time to understand that he wasn't her enemy. Patience was a weapon he had learned to wield during the long, grueling sieges of the war. Later that afternoon, he saw a rider approaching, not with the frantic urgency of a posse, but the slow, ambling pace of a neighbor. Elias tensed. his hand instinctively going to the Colt Peacemaker, holstered at his hip. He recognized the man, Silas Croft, a wiry old rancher whose property bordered his to the east. Silas was a gossip, his tongue as loose as his morals, but sometimes his chatter carried useful information. "Vance," Silas called out, reining in his tired-looking horse. He spat a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the dry ground. "Figured you'd have heard the commotion by now." Elias stayed on the porch, his expression unreadable. "I hear the wind," he said flatly. Silas chuckled. "A dry, rattling sound. More than wind stirring these parts. It's Jedediah Monroe. His boy, Clayton, got himself killed 2 nights back. Found him out by the old hanging oak. Throat cut." Silas leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "They say it was that new gal, the one who's been teaching the colored kids to read and write. As if they got any use for letters." Elias's blood ran cold. He kept his face a mask of indifference, focusing on the blade of his knife. He knew the woman in his cabin had to be the one Silas was talking about. "Sheriff's got a posse out," Silas continued, oblivious to the storm raging inside Elias. "But Jedediah's not waiting for no law. He's put up a reward himself. $500. A fortune for one woman. He wants her found, Vance. Says he'll burn half of Texas to the ground to do it. $500. Enough money to make a saint turn sinner. Enough to turn every neighbor into a bounty hunter." "Sounds like Monroe's problem," Elias said, making a final sharp pass with his knife. Silas grunted. "Is now. But a man with that much money to spend on vengeance makes problems for everyone. You keep your eyes peeled." He gave a curt nod and spurred his horse, riding off in a cloud of dust and leaving a suffocating tension in his wake. The news settled in Elias's gut like a lead weight. Clayton Monroe. He knew the name. A cold, familiar dread crept up his spine. It wasn't just any powerful man's son who had been killed. It was him. He stood up and walked back inside the cabin. The woman he had to stop thinking of her as the woman was sitting up straighter now. She had heard. He knew she had. The blanket was clutched so tightly in her hands that her knuckles were white. He looked at her. Truly looked at her. For the first time since he brought her here, the bruises were starting to fade to a sickly yellow, but the cuts were still stark against her dark skin. He saw the intelligence in her high forehead, the stubborn set of her jaw. She wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter. She had to be, to have survived what they did to her. "They're looking for you," he said, his voice low and direct. "They think you killed him." Clayton Monroe. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not guilt, but a deep, weary anger. Her lips parted, as if to speak, but she pressed them shut again. A silent battle raging within her. He didn't push. He just stood there, letting the weight of the new reality settle between them. He was harboring a fugitive, a woman accused of murdering the son of the most dangerous man in the state. He wasn't just an outsider anymore. He was an accomplice, an enemy. Just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and red, he heard it, the sound he had been dreading. The rhythmic beat of multiple horses, approaching at a purposeful, determined pace. This wasn't a neighbor. This was the law. He grabbed his rifle from its pegs by the door. He turned to her. "Get in the root cellar," he commanded, his voice sharp with urgency. He pointed to a trapdoor hidden beneath a bearskin rug. "Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." For a heart-stopping second, she didn't move, her eyes wide with a fresh wave of fear. Then, with a silent nod, she slid off the cot, her movements stiff with pain. She limped across the floor, lifted the heavy door, and disappeared into the darkness below just as the riders came into view. Elias pulled the rug back into place and stood by the door, his heart pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. He watched them approach. Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary face showed the strain of trying to keep a fragile peace, and behind him, a deputy whose youth was betrayed by his eager, cruel eyes. The law had arrived, and the first lie he would have to tell would be the most important one of his life. Sheriff Brody dismounted, his movements heavy with a fatigue that seemed bone-deep. His deputy, a young man named Hatcher, with a sneer permanently etched onto his face, remained on his horse, his hand resting on his holstered pistol as he surveyed Elias's modest homestead with open disdain. "Vance, Brody said, his voice a low gravel. He stopped at the edge of the porch, not stepping onto it, maintaining a careful distance. We're tracking the woman wanted for Clayton Monroe's murder. Figured we'd check the outlying ranches. Elias leaned against the doorframe, his rifle held loosely in one hand, pointed at the floorboards. He made his posture relaxed, his expression impassive. Just me and the coyotes out here, Sheriff. Same as always. Brody's eyes, gray and tired, met his. You sure about that? A woman on foot can't get far in this heat, especially if she's hurt. We heard she might have been. Below the floor, Elias could feel a faint vibration, a silent tremor of the woman's presence. He forced himself to remain still, to breathe evenly. Haven't seen anyone, hurt or otherwise. But if I do, I'll be sure to let you know. The deputy Hatcher scoffed. Jedediah Monroe's offering $500. Vance. A man like you could do a lot with that kind of money. The implication was clear. A man like you, a lone Yankee living on a scrap of land, must be desperate. Elias's gaze flicked to Hatcher, his eyes turning as cold and hard as river stones. Some things aren't for sale, deputy. A tense silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind whistling through the eaves. Brody seemed to weigh his options. He had no warrant, no proof, only a grim duty to follow a trail that had gone cold. Pushing a man like Vance, a former Union soldier with a reputation for being quiet but unyielding, was a risk. All right, Brody said finally, turning back to his horse. But be warned. Jedediah's men are riding their own patrols. They're not as patient as I am. He swung himself into the saddle. They find her here. They won't stop to ask questions. They'll burn this place to the ground with you in it. Elias watched them ride away, their silhouettes shrinking against the vast, indifferent landscape until they were gone. Only then did he allow himself to exhale. He waited another 5 minutes, scanning the horizon, before turning back inside and lifting the trapdoor. The woman emerged from the darkness, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a defiant fire. She looked at him, a question hanging unspoken in the air between them. They'll be back, he said, answering it. He walked to the window, peering out into the twilight. Or Monroe's men will. We don't have much time. That night, sleep was a luxury Elias couldn't afford. He sat in his chair by the dying fire, the rifle across his lap, his mind a maelstrom of past and present. The name Clayton Monroe had unlocked a part of his memory he had tried to bury for a decade. It wasn't just a name from the local gossip. It was a ghost from his own personal hell. He closed his eyes, and the scent of pine and dust in his cabin was replaced by the acrid smell of cannon smoke and mud. Cold Harbor, Virginia, 1864. The battle was a meat grinder, a senseless slaughter under a relentless sun. Elias was a corporal then, barely 20 years old, his uniform caked with the filth of the trenches. They had been pinned down for hours, the air alive with the buzz of Minié balls. During a brief, desperate lull, a small group of Confederate soldiers, their faces young and terrified, had tried to surrender, emerging from their position with their hands raised. And then he had appeared. Captain Clayton Monroe, his uniform impossibly clean, his face flushed with a righteous fury. He was mounted on a magnificent black stallion, a stark contrast to the mud-caked misery around him. No quarter for traitors, Monroe had roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. He had drawn his pistol and fired. Not at the Union line, but at the first of the surrendering boys. His own men. The boy from Ohio, the one Elias had failed to save, had been wounded in the initial charge. He was trying to crawl back to their line when Monroe's men, emboldened by their captain's savagery, opened fire on the wounded and the surrendering alike. It wasn't war. It was murder. Elias had watched, frozen in a mixture of horror and rage, as Monroe laughed, a chilling sound of triumph that had haunted his dreams ever since. Elias opened his eyes, the fire in his hearth now just glowing embers. The face of the man who had been killed was burned into his memory. Arrogant. Cruel. A man who found pleasure in the suffering of others. A profound realization settled over him. Saving the woman in the next room was no longer just about paying an old moral debt for the boy he'd left behind. It was about finishing a fight he hadn't known was still being waged. Clayton Monroe hadn't changed. He had just brought his own private war home to Texas. He stood and walked to the cot. The woman was asleep, her breathing deep, and even for the first time. The hard lines of fear on her face had softened, replaced by a vulnerability that struck him deep in his core. He had been a soldier, a killer, a man running from his past. But now, protecting her felt like the first truly meaningful thing he had done since he'd taken off his blue uniform. He wasn't just hiding a fugitive. He was sheltering an innocent from a monster he had met long ago. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he would not run this time. He would not fail. This was his line in the sand. He would see this through, or die trying. The days that followed were a quiet siege. Elias reinforced the latch on the door and kept a loaded shotgun near the window, his senses perpetually on high alert. The woman began to move about the small cabin during the day, her limp lessening, her strength slowly returning. She still didn't speak, but a silent understanding began to form between them. She would fold his bedroll in the morning after he came in from the porch. He would ensure the water bucket was always full. They were two solitary planets, orbiting each other in a shared dangerous space. The breakthrough came on the fourth night. The wind howled outside, a mournful sound that seemed to claw at the cabin's thin walls. Elias was cleaning his rifle by the firelight when she spoke, her voice so soft he almost missed it. "Why?" He stopped, his hands stilling on the oiled cloth. He looked up. She was sitting at the small, rough-hewn table, her hands clasped in her lap. It was the first word she had spoken to him. He thought for a moment, wanting to give an honest answer. "Because no one deserves to be left for the buzzards," he said finally, his voice low and even. She held his gaze, her dark eyes searching his. "They will kill you for this. They'll have to find you first," he replied, turning his attention back to the rifle, a signal that he wasn't looking for thanks or a debate. But the dam of her silence had been broken. Later, as he prepared to head back out to the porch, she spoke again. "He came to my school." Her voice was stronger now, laced with a cold, simmering anger. "Clayton Monroe. He told me I was putting ideas in children's heads. Said a woman like me had no business teaching anyone anything but how to serve." Elias paused at the door, listening. "He wanted me to close the school," she continued, her voice trembling slightly, not with fear, but with fury. "When I refused, he said he would find a way to make me." She took a shaky breath. 2 days later, a boy came with a note. It said his sister, one of my students, was sick and had fallen near the creek. He said she was calling for me. Elias turned to face her, his knuckles white where he gripped the door frame. "It was a trap." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I ran. I didn't think. When I got to the creek, his men were waiting. She trailed off, swallowing hard. The next thing I remember is waking up in the dark, my head pounding. I was lying near the oak tree, and he was there. Clayton, lying on the ground, not moving. She looked down at her hands. They said I did it. But I never touched him. I never had the chance." Elias listened, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He believed every word. It was exactly the kind of cowardly, cruel trap a man like Monroe would set. "The war, it changes a man," he found himself saying. The words coming from a place he kept locked away. "It taught me how to see things, how to recognize a certain kind of evil. I saw it in him years ago." He didn't elaborate, but the conviction in his voice was absolute. He finally stepped out onto the porch, leaving her with that thought. The night was cold, but he barely felt it. He was too consumed by the story she had told, a story that fit perfectly with the ghost from his past. An hour later, a sharp cry pierced the night. It was her. An animal sound of pure terror. He burst back into the cabin, his pistol drawn. She was sitting bolt upright on the cot, her eyes wide with the lingering horror of a nightmare. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her hands gripping the blanket. He holstered his weapon and approached slowly, his boots soft on the wooden floor. "You're safe," he said, his voice gentle. "It was just a dream." She looked at him, her defenses shattered by sleep. her face a mask of raw pain. "They were hanging me," she whispered, her voice cracking. I could feel the rope. He didn't know what to do. He wasn't a man built for comfort, but instinct took over. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, a simple, solid point of contact in the swirling chaos of her fear. His touch was firm, grounding. "I'm here," he said. "No one's going to hurt you." She flinched at first, then, surprisingly, leaned into the touch, drawing a shuddering breath. The warmth of his hand seemed to calm the tremors running through her. In that moment, they were not a white man and a black woman, a protector and a fugitive. They were just two people, scarred by a world that had tried to break them, finding a fragile moment of peace in a shared darkness. She eventually pulled back, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. The wall between them had crumbled. "My name is Serafina," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "My friends call me Sarah." He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The corner of his mouth twitched, the closest he ever came to a smile. "I'm Elias." It was a simple exchange, but it changed everything. They had names now. They had a shared history, however brief and violent. In the heart of a hostile land, under the threat of death, a fragile alliance, and perhaps something more had been forged. The fragile peace within the cabin was a stark contrast to the storm gathering outside. Word of the $500 reward had spread like wildfire, poisoning the air and turning neighbors into potential threats. Elias saw them now and then, riders cutting across the plains in the distance, their paths just a little too close to his property line for comfort. They weren't just searching, they were circling. The true threat, however, arrived a week after the sheriff's visit. Elias spotted them from the ridge, where he was checking his fences, a column of 5 riders, moving with the disciplined arrogance of a private army. At their head was a man on a formidable black horse, a figure of such rigid authority that he seemed to command the very land he rode across. Jedediah Monroe. Elias had only ever seen him from a distance in the nearby town of Redemption, but there was no mistaking him. He was a man carved from granite and fury, his back ramrod straight, his face a mask of cold, imperious grief. Elias ducked behind a cluster of rocks, his heart pounding. He watched as the posse fanned out, their movements methodical, sweeping the territory with a chilling efficiency. They weren't just looking for Sarah, they were asserting their dominion, reminding everyone who held the real power in this part of Texas. As they drew nearer, Elias focused on the rider to Jedediah's right. It was his other son, Caleb. Elias remembered seeing him in town. Where Clayton had been loud, brash, and cruel, Caleb was his opposite. Quiet, withdrawn, and perpetually shadowed by his father's and brother's overbearing presence. Now, in the saddle, he looked pale and haunted. His eyes weren't scanning the horizon with the predatory gleam of the other men. They were fixed on the ground, his expression a mixture of misery and something that looked like guilt. The posse rode past Elias's hidden position, their voices carrying on the wind. Jedediah's tone was sharp, barking orders. They were heading toward the shanties on the far side of the river, where the free black families lived. A wave of cold dread washed over Elias. Jedediah wasn't just searching. He was terrorizing. He was squeezing the community, knowing that someone, somewhere, must know something. Elias scrambled back to the cabin, his mind racing. "They're here," he said, bursting through the door. Sarah, who had been mending a tear in her dress, looked up, her eyes wide with alarm. "Monroe and his men. They're sweeping the area. It's no longer safe." Sarah's face hardened with a familiar resolve. "I cannot stay here and bring this down on you." "You're not," Elias said firmly. "We're not. We can't stay. We have to go." That night, they began to plan. Elias spread out an old, yellowed map on the table. It was a crude drawing of the territory, but it was enough. "The law runs thin west of the Pecos," he explained, his finger tracing a line through the rugged, unforgiving terrain. "New Mexico territory. It's a hard ride, but there are towns there, new ones, where people don't ask too many questions about a man's past." Sarah studied the map, her brow furrowed in concentration. "They will follow." "Let them," Elias said, a grim determination in his voice. "We'll travel by night. Stick to the canyons. I know this land. We can lose them." As they discussed routes and supplies, Sarah grew quiet. She stared at the map, but her thoughts were clearly elsewhere. "There's something wrong," she said suddenly. Elias looked at her. "What do you mean?" "The story," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The way they tell it. They found me with a knife. Said I used it on him." She shook her head. "They took my things when they ambushed me, my satchel, my books. But I never carried a knife, like the one they described. And there was something else." She looked up at him, her memory fighting to surface. "At the creek, before they grabbed me, I saw him. Clayton. He wasn't alone. He was arguing with someone. I was too far away to see who it was, hidden in the trees. Then, I remember something falling. Something that glinted in the moonlight before it hit the dirt." She closed her eyes, trying to recapture the image. It was small, silver, like a button from a gentleman's waistcoat, a silver button. The detail was so specific, so seemingly insignificant, yet it hung in the air between them, charged with meaning. It didn't belong to a teacher's attacker. It belonged to someone else entirely. Elias felt a shift, a new piece clicking into a puzzle he didn't know he was solving. This wasn't just a lynching born of prejudice. There was something more complicated at play. The man Clayton was arguing with, the silver button, it was a loose thread. And if they could pull it, the whole story might unravel. He looked from Sarah's determined face to the map spread on the table. Their plan had been to run, to disappear into the west and leave the ghosts of Texas behind. But now, a new, more dangerous idea began to take root in his mind. Running would save their lives, but finding the truth might just save her soul. "Before we go," he said, his voice low and resolute, "I'm going back. To the oak tree. To the scene of the crime." Sarah's eyes widened. "Elias, no. It's too dangerous. Monroe's men are everywhere. Which is why I'll go at night," he countered, his decision already made. "They think you're the only one with a secret. They're wrong. The truth of what happened that night is still out there, buried in the dirt. I'm going to find it." The moon was a sliver of bone in the black sky, offering little light and even less comfort. Elias moved through the darkness like a wraith, his senses tuned to the subtlest sounds, the snap of a twig, the call of a distant nightjar. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of an approaching rider. He left his horse tethered in a ravine a mile away, choosing to cover the final distance on foot. He reached the skeletal oak tree, a place now steeped in violence. The area was still trampled from the posse's initial investigation, but nature was already beginning to reclaim it. He started his search near the gnarled roots, where he'd found Sarah, his eyes scanning the ground with the intense focus of a man defusing a bomb. He worked in slow, concentric circles, his fingers sifting through the dirt and leaf litter. For nearly an hour, he found nothing but stones and dried leaves. Frustration began to gnaw at him. It was a fool's errand, a desperate gamble based on a fragmented memory. He was about to give up when his fingers brushed against something small, hard, and cool. He pulled it from the dirt and held it in his palm. Even in the faint moonlight, it shone with a dull luster. It was a silver button, intricately carved with the image of a hawk in flight. It was ornate, expensive, the kind of thing a wealthy man would wear on his waistcoat. It was exactly as Sarah had described. He clenched his fist around it, the metal cool against his skin. This was proof. Proof that someone else had been there. His search renewed. He moved away from the tree, toward the creek bank where Sarah had said the argument took place. Here, the ground was softer, more revealing. He saw the faint, overlapping tracks of two men in heavy boots. He followed them and found signs of a struggle, a deep scuff mark where a heel had dug in, a broken branch on a low-lying shrub. It wasn't the chaotic mess of a lynch mob. It was the distinct footprint of a two-man confrontation. A sudden sound, the sharp crack of a branch, jerked his head up. He dropped into a crouch behind a thicket of brush, his heart hammering in his chest. Two of Monroe's men were riding patrol along the creek bed, their lanterns casting long, dancing shadows. They were close. Too close. "Ain't nothing out here but ghosts," one of them grumbled, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "Jedediah pays us to look for ghosts, the other replied. Now shut up and keep your eyes open. They passed by, their lanterns receding into the darkness. Elias didn't move for a full 10 minutes, letting the silence resettle before he dared to breathe again. The close call was a stark reminder of the razor's edge he was walking. He pocketed the silver button and began his retreat, moving with even greater caution than before. He made it back to the cabin just before dawn, slipping through the door like a phantom. Sarah was waiting, her face etched with worry. She hadn't slept. He didn't say a word, simply opened his hand and showed her the button. Her eyes widened in recognition. A choked sob escaped her lips, a sound of vindication, of a terrible weight beginning to lift. It's his, she whispered, her voice trembling. Whose? Elias asked, his voice low and urgent. Caleb Monroe's, she said, looking up at him. He had a vest made in St. Louis. He was so proud of it. He wore it all the time. It had buttons just like this one. Caleb, the quiet, haunted brother. The pieces began to fall into place with sickening clarity. Caleb had been there. He had argued with Clayton. A struggle had ensued. But what did it mean? Did Caleb witness the murder? Did he try to intervene and fail? Or was it something darker? The questions swirled in Elias's mind. They now had evidence that pointed to someone else, but their witness was the brother of the victim and the son of the man hunting them. It was an impossible situation. This changes things, Elias said, pacing the small cabin. Running won't be enough. As long as they think it was you, they'll never stop looking. Jedediah won't care about the truth. He only cares about revenge. Sarah looked at the button in his hand, then at him. The fear in her eyes was still there, but it was now overlaid with a new, steely resolve. Then we cannot run from it, she said, her voice firm. We have to face it. We have to face him. Face who? Caleb, she said. He is the key. He is the only one who knows what really happened that night. He's living with a secret, and it's eating him alive. I can see it in his eyes. Elias stared at her. The plan forming in her mind was audacious, bordering on suicidal. To seek out the son of their mortal enemy, to confront him, and hope his conscience outweighed his fear of his own father. It was a long shot, a desperate play in a game where the odds were stacked impossibly against them. But as he looked at the silver button, a tangible piece of a buried truth, he knew she was right. They had been hunted. Now, it was time to become the hunters. They had to get to Caleb Monroe before his father's version of the story became the only one left to tell. The only question was how. The abandoned mission chapel stood on a low hill, its adobe walls crumbling, its bell tower a silent skeletal finger pointing at the bruised twilight sky. It was a place of forgotten prayers, a neutral ground between the Monroe Empire and Elias's isolated ranch. It was here, in this decaying sanctuary, that the final hand would be played. Getting a message to Caleb had been a risk in itself. Elias had relied on an old stable hand named Samuel, a man whose quiet dignity and deep-seated hatred for the Monroes made him trustworthy. Samuel had slipped a note to Caleb in town, a simple, cryptic message. I have what you lost at the creek. Meet me at the old mission. Midnight. Come alone. Now Elias and Sarah waited in the shadows of the chapel's nave, the air thick with the dust of 100 years and the suffocating weight of anticipation. Elias stood near the crumbling altar, his shotgun held ready. Sarah waited near the entrance, a silhouette against the moonlit doorway, her courage a palpable force in the darkness. Right at midnight, a lone figure on horseback appeared on the ridge. Caleb. He dismounted and approached the chapel with the hesitant steps of a man walking to his own execution. He pushed open the heavy, groaning door and stepped inside, his face pale and drawn in the moonlight that streamed through the collapsed roof. Who's there? He called out, his voice trembling. Elias stepped out of the shadows. We are. Caleb flinched as Sarah moved into the light. He stared at her, his expression a chaotic mix of fear, pity, and something else. Something that looked like shame. You're alive, he whispered, his gaze fixed on Sarah. No thanks to your family, Elias said, his voice hard as flint. He took a step forward, holding out his hand. The silver hawk button gleamed in his palm. I believe this is yours. Caleb's eyes locked onto the button. and any semblance of composure he had shattered. His shoulders slumped, and a ragged breath escaped his lips. He looked like a man finally unburdened of a weight too heavy to carry. "What happened that night, Caleb?" Sarah asked, her voice not accusatory but firm and clear. "Tell us the truth." Caleb sank onto a rickety pew, burying his face in his hands. His confession came out in a torrent of choked, desperate words. "It was me," he began. "I was there. Clayton." He found out what I was doing. He looked up, his eyes pleading. "I've been helping people. Some of the families who work for my father, they're little more than slaves. I've been giving them money, drawing them maps to get north. A way out." Clayton found a letter. He was going to tell my father, not just about me, but about every family I helped. He said he'd hunt them all down. Sarah's eyes widened in understanding. One of the families Caleb had helped was that of her student, the one she'd been lured out to help. "I met him at the creek to try and reason with him," Caleb continued, his voice cracking. "But there's no reasoning with Clayton." He laughed. He said he'd enjoy watching my father make an example of them. He grabbed me. We fought." Caleb's voice dropped to a barely audible whisper. "I didn't mean to." He fell and hit his head on a rock. There was so much blood. I panicked. I ran. The truth was more complex and tragic than they could have imagined. But before they could process it, another sound cut through the night. The thunder of hoofbeats. Many of them. "You were followed," Elias snarled, grabbing his shotgun as he pushed Sarah behind the stone altar. Caleb looked up, his face ashen with a new, more immediate terror. "Number, it's a trap. My father." He must have suspected. The chapel was suddenly flooded with light as a dozen men carrying torches surrounded the building. The figure of Jedediah Monroe filled the doorway, his face a demonic mask in the flickering light. His eyes, burning with a cold fire, fixed on Caleb, then moved to Elias and Sarah with an expression of triumphant hatred. "So, the rat finally scurries out of its hole," Jedediah boomed, his voice echoing in the stone chamber, "and finds another one to conspire with. I knew you were weak, Caleb, but I never knew you were a traitor." "Father, listen," Caleb started, but Jedediah cut him off. "I have nothing more to say to you. As for these two," he gestured to Elias and Sarah, "kill them. Leave no witnesses." The men surged forward. Elias fired the shotgun, the blast deafening in the enclosed space, sending two men staggering back. But he was hopelessly outnumbered. A man tackled him from the side, and the gun clattered to the floor. He fought back with the desperation of a cornered wolf, his fists and elbows a flurry of motion. But they were swarming him. He saw two men grab Sarah, her cry of outrage cut short as they pinned her against the wall. He saw Jedediah raise a pistol, his aim steady, pointed directly at Elias's chest. This was it. The end. No. A single piercing scream cut through the chaos. It was Caleb. He had scrambled for a dropped pistol, and now stood on the altar steps, his hands shaking violently, the gun aimed not at Elias, but directly at his own father. "Stop!" Caleb screamed, tears streaming down his face. "Leave them alone! It was me! I killed him!" The chapel fell into a sudden, stunned silence. Every eye turned to Caleb. Jedediah froze, his pistol unwavering, his face a canvas of disbelief and fury. "I did it!" Caleb's voice rose, filled with a year's worth of guilt and anguish. He was a monster. He was going to destroy innocent lives for his own amusement, and I stopped him. I killed my brother. The confession hung in the air. An irrefutable, world-shattering truth. The men, holding Elias and Sarah, loosened their grip, their expressions shifting from bloodlust to confusion. They looked from the weeping son to the thunderstruck father. Jedediah Monroe's face seemed to crumble. The iron mask of his authority cracked, revealing the broken old man beneath. His empire, his legacy, his entire world, all of it, had been built on a lie that had just been incinerated by his own son's words. In that moment of shocked paralysis, a new figure appeared in the doorway. Sheriff Brody, his face grim, his shotgun held at the ready. He had clearly followed the posse, anticipating the violent conclusion. He took in the scene the armed son, the broken father, the two fugitives, and the stunned witnesses. The law, however late, had finally arrived, and the truth, bloody and raw, had finally been set free. The aftermath was not a storm, but a quiet, hollow wind. Caleb Monroe's confession shattered the foundation of his family's power more effectively than any bullet could have. He was taken into custody by Sheriff Brody, his surrender a strange mix of terror and profound relief. The posse, leaderless and faced with a truth that stripped all righteousness from their cause, simply dissolved, melting back into the night like ashamed ghosts. Jedediah Monroe did not rage or fight. He simply stood amidst the ruins of the old chapel, a man suddenly aged 100 years. His empire of fear reduced to a family tragedy of his own making. He didn't even look at Elias and Sarah as Sheriff Brody gestured for them to leave. The fight was over. 2 days later, as a pale dawn broke over the plains, Elias and Sarah prepared to leave the small cabin that had been both a prison and a sanctuary. Elias had sold the ranch to a quiet German family, eager to start fresh and willing to pay in cash, no questions asked. The money wasn't much, but it was enough. Sheriff Brody paid them one last visit. He sat on his horse, looking weary but resolute. "Caleb will stand trial," he said. With the testimonies of the families he helped, and the general sentiment about his brother, he might just get a manslaughter charge. He won't hang. Brody paused, his gaze shifting between Elias and Sarah. "But this place, it has a long memory. It will never be safe for you. My advice is to ride west and don't look back." It was advice they were already taking. They traveled light, with 2 sturdy horses and saddlebags filled with enough supplies to get them to New Mexico territory. The journey was arduous, a blur of dusty trails, cold nights, and the constant, unspoken fear of being followed. But for the first time, they weren't running from something. They were riding toward it. They talked during the long hours in the saddle, their stories filling the vast, empty spaces around them. He told her about the boy from Ohio, the ghost he had carried for a decade. She told him about the Quaker family who had raised her, who had taught her that a book could be a greater weapon than a gun. They were no longer just survivors sharing a foxhole. They were 2 halves of a whole, their jagged, broken edges fitting together in a way that made them both stronger. One night, under a blanket of stars so bright they looked like spilled diamonds, he reached for her hand. His touch was no longer just for comfort or reassurance. It was a question. She answered by interlacing her fingers with his, her grip firm and sure. In the quiet heart of the wilderness, their love, born in violence and nurtured in fear, was finally allowed to breathe. Months later, they arrived in a green valley in the New Mexico territory a year later, a place where the mountains kissed the sky, and a clear river cut a life-giving path through the land. It was a place where a person's worth was measured by the strength of their back and the truth in their eyes, not the color of their skin or the ghosts in their past. Elias, with his own hands, built a small, sturdy house from pine and river stone. It was bigger than his old cabin, with wide windows to let in the light. Sarah started a new school, not in a hidden shack, but out in the open, under the shade of a large cottonwood tree. Her students were a mix of faces, the children of Mexican ranchers, white homesteaders, and even a few Navajo who lived nearby. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting a golden glow over their small patch of earth, Sarah stood by the riverbank. She was humming a soft tune, one hand resting on the gentle, unmistakable swell of her belly. Elias came to stand beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. He followed her gaze to the house, where smoke curled invitingly from the chimney, and then to the small group of children heading home, their laughter echoing in the valley. The scars of their past would always be a part of them. The memory of the hanging oak, the echo of gunfire in a ruined chapel. Those things could never be fully erased. But they were no longer chains. They were just reminders of the price they had paid for this peace, for this life. "We made it, Elias," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. He looked down at her, at the incredible woman who had faced down death and injustice with unwavering courage, and then at the new life they had created together. The ghosts of Texas were finally silent. "No, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. He placed his hand over hers on her stomach. "We're just getting started." Together, they watched the river flow, peaceful and endless, under a sky full of promise. In a world that had tried to bury them in ashes, they had found a place where new life could not only sprout, but flourish.